for the day. The war in Ukraine remains locked in a long duration trench phase. Heavy artillery exchanges and drone strikes continue along multiple fronts, with no decisive territorial breakthroughs by either side. Western military aid to Ukraine is ongoing, while Russia maintains pressure through sustained mobilization and industrial scale ammunition production. This war is no longer about rapid victory. It is about endurance, logistics, and political will, a pattern likely to define future large scale wars. Ceasefire talks continue intermittently, but sporadic fighting and humanitarian strain persists in Gaza. Regional actors remain on high alert, with no conflict still carrying the risk of wider regional escalation, even as major powers push to keep it contained. Temporary pauses do not resolve structural conflicts. The region remains unstable due to unresolved political roots, not battle outcomes alone. Major economies are holding a wait and watch stance on interest rates. Inflation has eased in many regions, but growth remains uneven. Debt levels, geopolitical risks, and supply chain disruptions continue to weigh on long term stability. The world economy is stabilizing, but fragility remains. Policy decisions are defensive, not expansionist. China, economic pressure, and strategic signaling. China continues to face slow growth, property sector stress, and continuous consumer spending. At the same time, Beijing is increasing diplomatic and military signaling in the Asia Pacific, especially around Taiwan and South China Sea. China is managing internal economic stress while projecting external strength, a delicate balancing act. Global security, drones, and surveillance redefine warfare. Across conflict zones, drones, electronic warfare, and intelligence systems are now central tools. Traditional large scale troop movements are increasingly risky, reinforcing a shift towards concealment, precision, and attrition based conflict. Modern warfare rewards invisibility and patience, not spectacle. The world is entering an era of long conflicts, cautious economics, and strategic restraint, where endurance matters more than dramatic action. United States government funding physical discipline physical discipline. In the United States, political negotiations continue around federal budget priorities and long term fiscal sustainability. Lawmakers remain divided on spending levels, especially on social programs, defense allocations, and deficit control. While short term funding measures prevent immediate shutdown risk, structural budget disagreements remain unresolved. US governance is stable day to day, but long term fiscal clarity is still lacking, affecting investor confidence and policy predictability. United States immigration and border management. Immigration continues to be a major domestic policy issue. Federal and state authorities are debating enforcement responsibilities, asylum processing capacity, and resource allocation. Border states are pressing Washington for clearer coordination and funding support. Immigration is no longer just a border issue, it is now a nationwide political and administrative challenge. Technology, regulation, and big tech scrutiny. United States regulators are increasing scrutiny of large technology companies, focusing on competition, data privacy, and market dominance. Antitrust discussions and regulatory proposals continue to shape the future relationship between government and Silicon Valley. North America is assessing the balance between innovation freedom and regulatory control in the digital economy. Canada, housing affordability and cost of living. In Canada, rising housing costs and affordability concerns remain the center of debate. The federal government and provincial authorities are under pressure to increase housing supply while managing inflation and population growth driven by immigration. Economic stress in Canada is socially visible, not just macroeconomic, influencing voter sentiment and policy direction. Mexico continues to face security challenges linked to organized crime, alongside efforts to strengthen law enforcement coordination and judicial effectiveness. Authorities are focusing on institutional reforms while managing public safety concerns. Security remains a key constraint on Mexico's long term economic and social stability. North America is politically stable but internally stretched, managing fiscal discipline, migration pressure, technology regulation, housing affordability, and security challenges rooted more in governance than external threats. Argentina continues to navigate a difficult adjustment phase. Inflation remains high, purchasing power is under pressure, and subsidy reductions are reshaping daily life. The government is pushing fiscal discipline and market oriented reforms, while public resistance and labor unrest persist. Brazil remains politically stable, but economic growth is uneven. The government is balancing social spending commitments with fiscal responsibility while monitoring inflation and investor sentiment. Environmental policy and Amazon protection continue to influence Brazil's global standing. Venezuela's political standoff remains unresolved. Sanctions weakened oil production and migration pressure continues to strain the economy. While limited diplomatic engagements exist, structural recovery remains distant. Venezuela's crisis is no longer sudden. It's systematic, it's systemic and long term, affecting the entire region through migration and economic spillover. Chile and Peru continue facing political fragmentation and public dissatisfaction. Leadership transitions, constitutional debates, and corruption concerns are shaping governance. Economic fundamentals remain relatively stable, but public trust in institutions is fragile. Across South America, migration flows, urban crime, and inequality are placing pressure on government. Many countries are strengthening law enforcement while also addressing root causes such as unemployment and weak public services. South America is not facing sudden collapse but also moving structural stress, economic pressure, and public trust erosion, defining the region today. Across South America, the struggle is not for power but for stability. As governments attempt reform and social pressure and long-standing structural weaknesses. The European economy continues to face slow growth, high living costs, and pressure on public finances, while inflation has eased comparison while inflation has eased compared to previous peaks. Household confidence remains weak. Governments are balancing fiscal discipline and social support, especially as elections approach in several member states. Economic stress is increasingly shaping European conflicts, influencing voter behavior and policy choices. European governments remain committed to supporting Ukraine, but strategic fatigue is visible. Military aid continues, yet debates over funding, weapon supply, and long-term sustainability are growing. Public opinion across Europe shows concern about prolonged conflict and economic spillover. Europe wants to support Ukraine, but also seeks stability and predictability, not open-ended escalation. Germany and France continue to act as Europe's core political engines, but both face domestic challenges. Germany faces Germany struggles with industrial competitiveness and energy costs, and France faces a social unrest and political fragmentation. Europe's leadership centers remain influential but internally constrained, slowing decisive action. Migration remains one of the Europe's most sensitive issues. Southern and eastern borders face increased pressure while internal divisions persist over burden sharing and asylum policy. Governments are strengthening border controls while negotiating collective European Union responses. Migration is testing European unity, revealing differences between priorities and shared ideals. European unions are increasing defense spending and strengthening NATO coordination. This marks long-term shift in European security thinking, moving away from decades of reliance on diplomacy alone. Europe is adapting to a more insecure world, but this transition is a gradual and cautious. Europe is navigating complex phase where economic stress, war fatigue, migration pressure, and security concerns intersect, pushing the continent towards cautious reform rather than bold transformation. Europe today is less focused on expansion and ambition and more focused on stability, cohesion, and managing long term pressure. The situation around Gaza remains tense but contained, while large scale fighting has paused at times. The underlying political and security issues remain unresolved. Humanitarian conditions continue to be difficult, and negotiations focus more on temporary management than long term solutions. In the Middle East, ceasefire often reduce violence temporarily but do not end conflicts. Structure causes Structural causes remain intact. Iran continues to exert influence across region through diplomatic positioning and indirect involvement in regional conflicts. At the same time, Tehran avoids a direct confrontation, balancing deterrence with restraint amid sanctions and economic pressure. Iran's strategy prioritizes leverage over escalation, maintaining influence without triggering full scale war. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar continue pushing economic diversification beyond oil. Investments in infrastructure, tourism, technology, and global finance remain central alongside efforts to maintain regional stability. The Gulf states are planning for a post oil future, prioritizing long term economic security over regional confrontation. The conflict in Yemen remains unresolved despite reduced international attention. Ceasefire efforts exist, but political fragmentation and humanitarian challenges persist. Across the region, states and non state actors operate in a climate of controlled tension. Missile defenses, intelligence operations, and proxy dynamics dominate, while direct state to state war is carefully avoided. The Middle East functions under a balance of fear, where everyone prepares for conflict but works to avoid future works to avoid full-scale war. The Middle East is not defined by constant war but by managed instability, where diplomacy, deterrence, and indirect conflict shape regional dynamics more than open battles. In the Middle East, power is exercised less through open confrontation and more through patience, positioning, and control pressure. Several countries in the Sahel, including Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, remain under military-led governments. These states continue facing security threats from extremist groups while relations with Western nations remain strained. New regional alignments are emerging as these countries seek alternative security partnership. Africa's Sahel is shifting from traditional alliances driven by security desperation rather than technology. Sudan's internal conflict continues with no clear resolution. Fighting between the factions has rival factions has displaced millions and created severe humanitarian crisis. Diplomats' efforts exist, but fragmentation among armed groups makes peace negotiations difficult. Several West African nations are experiencing political stress, including disputed elections, protests, and declining trust in democratic institutions. Economic hardship and youth unemployment remain central drivers of unrest. Democracy in Africa is challenged less by rejection and more by delivery failure. Citizens demand result, not slogans. East Africa continues to face climate related stress, including droughts and irregular rainfall. These pressures affect agriculture, food prices, and rural stability, forcing governments to balance immediate relief with long term resilience planning. Africa's overall economic growth remains uneven. Some countries show resilience through technology services and regional trade, while others struggle with debt inflation and infrastructure gaps. South Asia continues to show economic growth momentum driven by population, consumption, and services. However, inflation, employment quality, and income inequality remain pressing challenges across the region. Governments are balancing growth ambitions with social stability. South Africa's strength lies in the scale, but delivery and inclusion determine long term stability. Pakistan remains under significant political and economic pressure. Currency weakness, debt obligations, and governance challenges continue to dominate public life. Civil military dynamics remain influential in shaping political outcome. Afghanistan remains largely isolated from global systems. Humanitarian conditions are fragile with limited economic activity and restricted international engagement. Regional countries are focused on stability and spillover containment rather than transformation. Afghanistan is being managed as containment issue, not a development project. Countries such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan are gaining strategic relevance due to their energy resource and geographic position between Europe and Russia, Russia, China, and South Asia. These states are cautiously diversifying partnerships while maintaining internal control. Central Asia's importance is growing silently, driven by geography and energy rather than ideology. Across South Asia, countries are emphasizing border management, internal security, and deterrence rather than warfare. Rather than large-scale warfare, tensions exist, but escalation is carefully controlled. Asian continues to project regional unity, but internal differences remain visible. Member states are balancing national priorities with collective positions on trade, security, and diplomacy. Consensus-based decision-making remains slow, but it prevents sharp internal fractures. Myanmar's internal conflict continues with no political settlement in sight. Fighting between military and resistance groups persists when humanitarian segment while humanitarian conditions worsen. Asian diplomatic engagement has had limited impact so far. Countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia remain cautious and amid maritime tensions. Diplomatic protests, patrol, and negotiations continue, but escalation is deliberately avoided. Asian states focus on protecting economic interests while avoiding direct confrontation. Indonesia continues to manage political transition while maintaining economic stability. The country remains a key regional anchor due to its population size and democratic institutions and diplomatic weight and, and diplomatic weight within Asia. Southeast China, Southeast Asia continues to benefit from global supply chain diversification, especially in the manufacturing and electronics. Countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia attract investment as companies reduce dependence on single country production hubs. Southeast Asia's economic relevance is rising quietly through manufacturing and trade. Southeast Asia is defined by pragmatism, avoiding conflict, protecting trade, and maintaining stability, a competitive geopolitical statement. China continues to manage economic headwinds, including weaker consumer confidence, property sector stress, and cautious private investment. At the same time, Beijing remains a firm strategic posture. At the same time, Beijing maintains a firm strategic posture in regional and global affairs, signaling strength through diplomacy, military exercises, and long-term planning. China is balancing internal economic stress with external strategic confidence. aiming to project stability despite these domestic challenges. Taiwan remains a central point of regional sensitivity. Political transitions are being closely watched by regional and global powers. While Taiwan acquires, while Taiwan continues strengthening to its defensive preparedness, it avoids provocative moves relying on diplomacy and deterrence. It avoids provocation moves relying on diplomacy and deterrence rather than confrontation. Japan continues its gradual shift towards more proactive security posture. Defense spending is rising and the coordination with allies is deepening. At the same time, Japan remains cautious, grounding its security policy within constitutional and diplomatic limits. Japan is redefining its role from purely economic power to major security contributor. North Korea continues missile testing and military signaling, while South Korea focuses on deterrence and alliance coordination. Despite periodic escalation in rhetoric, both sides and avoid actions that could trigger uncontrollable conflict. Across Far East Asia, countries are modernizing military capabilities while maintaining diplomatic channels. Economic interdependence acts as a resistance, discouraging direct conflict despite deep strategic mistrust. Far East Asia is defined by strategic caution under pressure, where power is displayed through readiness and signaling rather than direct confrontation. Australia continues to face cost of living pressure driven by high housing costs, interest rates, and inflation sensitive services. While employment remains relatively strong, household budgets are under strain, shaping public debate and policy focus. Australia's economy is stable on paper, but social pressure is rising beneath the surface. Australia remains deeply aligned with its allies on Indo Pacific security, emphasizing defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, and regional stability. The focus is on deterrence and preparedness rather than confrontation. Australia's strategic posture is preventive, designed to avoid conflict through strength and alliance. New Zealand continues to prioritize economic moderation, social cohesion, and public welfare. Growth remains modest, and policymakers are focused on inflation control, housing affordability, and maintaining social trust. New Zealand emphasizes stability and social balance over rapid expansion. Both Australia and New Zealand are increasing engagement with Pacific Island nations, focusing on climate resilience, development aid, and regular partnerships. Climate change remains a central strategic and humanitarian concern in the Pacific. Climate policy is not just environmental, it is geopolitical in the Pacific region. The Australia New Zealand regions remain calm, predictable, and institutionally strong, with limited internal conflict. However, long term planning reflects awareness of more competitive global environment. Australia and New Zealand operate as stable rules based societies, balancing economic pressure, strategic responsibility, and regional engagement without dramatic shifts. In Australia and New Zealand, strength lies not in urgency but in stability, planning, and institutional resilience. Prime Minister Narendra Modi chaired multiple high level meetings this week, focusing on infrastructure execution, manufacturing growth, and welfare delivery. efficiency. Senior officials from the Prime Minister Office, Niti Ayog, and key ministers were present. The Ministry of Finance, led by Nirmala Sitharaman, continues preparations for upcoming fiscal planning with focus on capital expenditure, subsidy rationalization, manufacturing link incentives. Senior officials from Department of Economic Affairs and RBI coordination teams are involved. The Reserve Bank of India is under the Reserve Bank of India under Governor Shakti Kanta Das has maintained a cautious monetary stance, monitoring inflation, liquidity, and global financial condition. RBI continues active engagement with banks on credit flow and financial stability. The Ministry of External Affairs, led by Dr. S. Jaishankar, continues diplomatic engagement with United States, European Union, Gulf countries, and neighboring South Asian states. The Ministry of Defense and the Indian Armed Forces continue operational readiness activities on land, across land, sea, and air domains. Chief of Defense Staff and Services chiefs remain engaged in modernization, procurement, and joint initiatives. Leaders from major political parties, including Bharatiya Janata Party, Indian National Congress, and regional parties, continue public engagement and political positioning on governance, economy, and social issues, both inside and outside Parliament. With ISRO, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, and Ministry of Road Transport and Highways. Central and state security agencies continue monitoring internal security, border management, and cyber security, with coordination between Ministry of Home Affairs, state governments, and several agencies. Across governance, economy, diplomacy, and security, India's institutions remain actively engaged in managing growth, stability, and global positioning. That's our detailed analysis on global issues. Thank you for tuning in with us. Have a great day.